Australian English is actually part of a family of English accents. And at Sydney's 18-foot yacht races, you can hear the crews speaking with all the accents of that family.
Australia and New Zealand and South Africa were settled in what is roughly the same period, and from the point of view of the linguist, the same period. And there are great similarities between the three dialects. In South Africa, the white person became a managerial subject very quickly, and so South African English tends to climb towards the more prestigious varieties which are available.
Australians and New Zealanders say that this kind of sailing can carry them faster than the wind. Crews from both countries have very similar accents. Even some locals can have difficulty telling them apart. Australia's Rob Brown is world champion 18-foot skipper.
There has been known to be betting on these races. Officially there isn't, but Australians have been known to sort of bet on two flies calling up a window. The boats are very demanding boats to sail. It needs coordination between three people and split-second timing. You must be agile. I think they're the hardest boat in the world to sail.
The New Zealand crew shares an almost identical pronunciation of a word like sail.
We like to think that they're about the fastest boat in the world that can actually sail around a racing course in all conditions. The sails are so large that any little puff of wind they want to tip over. It's a bit like walking a tightrope, really.
What separates them is the fact that New Zealand had a greater feeling of identity with the old country than Australia did, where, of course, alienation begins with the convicts. And so you get the same base, but then it points off in different directions.
How are you, mate? How are you, mate?
John Bernard likes to measure the nuances of the Australian accent scientifically. He plots the rhythms of Australian speech and says that despite its Cockney beginnings, much of Australian English is unique.
How are you, mate?
There are many differences between London English and Australian English.
How are you, mate?
In general, Australians sound the H. If you regard the dropping of an H as a Cockney feature, then this is a difference between Cockney and Australian English. How are you, mate? How are you, mate? The Australian dialect doesn't have the glottal stop. That's the sound in a pronunciation like bottle. The whole range of ordinary vowels in Australian English take a set of values which are different from those in Cockney. This situation has been confirmed by studies of lip movement, some in the course of an X-ray analysis of the vocal mechanism.
Can you grimace now?
And some by high-speed photography, which shows the front of the face and the side of the face at the same time.
Cheam. George.
It would not be true to say that Australians don't open their lips at all, but it would be true, I think, on present evidence, to say that they open them less than some emphatic British speakers.
Sir. Sue.
This distinctive Australian accent, like its Cockney ancestor, was despised for generations. Cultivated Australians were often ashamed of their speech. The Australian opera singer Dame Nellie Melba complained about our twisted vowels, our distortions and flatness of speech, which, she said, seriously prejudices other people against us. Until quite recently, many Australians shared that attitude. Today, Australian comedians play off this cultural cringe and make it part of their act. In this generation, there's been a reaction to this cultural cringe. In fact, it's become a minor Australian industry in theatre and entertainment. Far from apologizing for Australian speech, they're exploiting it to the hilt. By exaggerating its characteristics, Australian comedians mock both their fellow countrymen, who cringe, and the British, who condescend. The effect has been to make a lot of Australians feel good about their accent. So, humor is having a significant impact on the language, as it always does. The founder and high priest of this cult of self-mockery, who uses the most colorful Australian language as his raw material, is the writer-performer Barry Humphries. The best living Australianisms have become an essential part of his satirical impersonations. All this would horrify his most celebrated creation, the Melbourne housewife, Dame Edna Everage.
Oh, well, I think, if I may, I think I must say a word for the women. Speak to Australian women. I think we are the custodians of correct Australian speech. I'm sorry, but we are. A lot of our menfolk, I think, speak a little too roughly for my liking, particularly people that Barry Humphries employs in his shows. Celeste Patterson is an example, I think, of a very poor type of Australian speaker, and I wouldn't like people overseas, particularly in the old country, as we call England, to judge Australia by that.
How are you, Leader? Beautiful. What a nice turn-up.
Another Humphries character, Sir Les Patterson, is supposed to be an Australian cultural attaché. Sir Les parodies the typical ochre, the broadest Australian speech and behavior. Everyone goes along with the joke. Australia's ABC went live when he launched his latest record and book.
12 inches of Les and the Traveller's Tool.
So Les, I've been taking a close look at your Traveller's Tool, and in it you've got words like conchi, cobber, chunder, chuck. Now, these words may be indispensable here in Australia, but what use would they be to a traveller who's attempting intercourse in foreign parts?
I presume you mean social intercourse. That's how I read it anyway. Why do Australians have sexual intercourse so quickly, you know? The old story is so they can get down the pub and tell the fellas, you know?
Australian English abounds in ripe comic similes. Humphries loves phrases like a kangaroo loose in the top paddock for a crazy person, as scarce as rocking horse manure, as happy as a bastard on Father's Day, a veranda over the toy shop for a paunch, and hanging around like a fart in a phone box.
I felt rather like those composers of the early, English composers of the early 20th century. Vaughan Williams crouching behind a hedge, recording a ploughboy's whistle. I used to interview taxi drivers. I used to make jottings. I found a lot of these notebooks. And, of course, although I collected a lot of the rich and generally scatological Australian vernacular, I made up a lot of it, too.
Yeah, a little lady.
Tell us what burning social issues keep you awake at night.
Well, generally I get a burning social issue in the morning if I get one.
Most of us who go to England try to get rid of our Australian accents if we can, or we did. It's less fashionable to do so now. And some of us actually put on a stronger Australian accent than we really have. Anxiety may be the reason for this, because we've always felt, with our accents, rather inferior, you see, to our English cousins. As indeed we are.
One champion of the Australian voice with no worries about inferiority is Alan Morris. With his partner, Alan Johnson, he set up Mojo, the first advertising agency to take the radical step of shooting all its commercials in Australian English.
Well, there's no such thing as an Australian accent in television advertising, particularly until about 10 or 12 years ago. One considered the Australian public probably ashamed of our pretty grating nasal sort of accent.
The Australian accent just wasn't used because it wasn't classy enough. And it did great. It was so unusual to hear it. It would grate on ourselves to hear it. We just didn't realise how we spoke because you didn't hear it on air very often, except in comedy shows or to send something up.
We just started speaking on television and commercials in the language that belonged to the people. And there's 15 million people out there that aren't here. They don't seem to be too ashamed about communicating